Hi, welcome to the Cognitively Techniques Mental Health interview series. So in this series, our host, Professor Skip Rizzo, will be engaging dialogues with various experts in digital mental health field. So today, our host, Professor Skip Rizzo, will interview our amazing speaker today, Kent Bai. Welcome, he is the creator of Voices of VR podcast. Hi, Kent.
Hello, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so this series is brought by Cognitive Leap Solutions, Inc. So here at Cognitive Leap, we are very passionate about finding solutions using professional resources, integrating high-tech products and advanced applications, and combining the latest technologies with humanistic care to address prevalent problems with attention, learning, and emotional issues among children and adolescents aged 3 to 18. So Cognitive Leap is founded in California in 2015, and we have a headquarters in Shanghai and an operations center in Shenzhen as well. So our main product, the VRAT, which is worked by Dr. Skip Rizzo, and we have a very strong research team that will be focusing on in approval of our virtual reality classroom from FDA and diagnosis children for ADHD. So I would like to introduce our host, Professor Skip Rizzo.
All right. Thank you, Jessica. I can't tell you all how happy I am today to be interviewing Kent Bai. I think what he's accomplished in really just a few years is no less than groundbreaking. I think we're seeing so much rapid change in the VR field across all areas. And along the way, Kent has been dogged and going to conferences and doing interviews online and really being the voice of VR in some ways by interviewing people that are in the field and building out this giant library of over 1,000 published interviews. It's really historical documentation in a grand scale. And I expect that while they provide a lot of useful information and engagement now, that 20 years from now, when people want to study the history of VR, they're going to go back to these recordings and see what people really thought, even 50, 100 years from now. That's one of the benefits or the downfalls of the digital era. Everything exists forever. It's just going to be a matter of sifting through and finding what you need. But on that element, I think also Kent's recent number 1,000 recorded podcast is a 3-hour epic where he's gone through and selected items and basically told a history of VR using the voices of people that have been there along the way and people emerging in the field and so forth. So I'll put that link on in the chat area later. And if folks want to check it out, it'll also be with recording. I think that would be a great first taste of the epic work that Kent has done. But Kent does a lot more than that. We met, I guess it was 2017, as you refresh my memory, at IEEE tour at our center, and we did an interview there. But I seem to recall we met another time and did another interview at the Society for Brain Mapping and Therapeutics conference, but I have an old memory. I need a little VR memory training myself. But and then we had incredible pleasure of a stimulating pleasure of being in France at the Laval virtual conference in Laval, France, where the organizers of the conference set up a brainstorming session for 2 or 3 days before the start of the convention, the conference, and set it up in a provincial French mansion where Kent, myself, and a few other folks basically lived there and spent a couple of days brainstorming and laying out frameworks on a whole variety of topics. But one of the big ones in our particular session was on ethics, and we'll touch on that a little bit later. I think it's an important area, and I think Ken has taken the elements of the brainstorm session that we had in Laval and really ran with it in a very powerful way. So we'll touch on all these topics. But first, Kent, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you were doing and what led up to the idea of voices in VR? And take it from there.
Yeah, thanks, Skip. It's a real pleasure to be here today. And I started into VR on January 1st, 2014. That's when I bought my Oculus Rift DK1. It had already been out for about 9 months. So it was a little late to the modern resurgence of consumer VR, but it was at the time when there had been a lot of games that had been out there and an educational experience called Titans of Space. And I saw just a kind of a top 20 recap of the different immersive games that are out there. And about my Rift, and 3 weeks later in Portland, Oregon, here I was at a game jam and developed a game, and from there it was like wanting to really understand what this medium was and what the design affordances were, coming from a perspective of wanting to make my own experiences. But then what ended up happening was that I just started going to what ended up being about 100 events from over a 7-year period, in real life events from 2014 to 2019. Recorded about 1,600 oral history interviews. And I guess the thing that is just driving me is just this insatiable curiosity about what this medium is and where it's going. And I remember, meeting you in 2017, IEEE VR. I attended my first IEEE VR in 2015. That was in Arles, France. And there's been this kind of like, the academic VR, which is some people call the old VR, and the sort of consumer VR, the new VR. And when I first got into the field, it was almost like shall the two meet. It was almost like this split that was happening. And part of what I wanted to do in some sense was to help create this bridge between people like yourself who've been in VR for many, many years, have many different insights, but a lot of people who are maybe making games in Unreal Engine and Unity were not really aware of the historical context of what had already come before. And so just really trying to connect to that wisdom and that research, and then see what's new and what is to be added to sort of academic VR that, a lot of programmer art or aspects of experiential design or game design or immersive storytelling. There's other things that the academic community is not as strong in. And so, just trying to figure out like, what are the conceptual frameworks to be able to make sense of this based upon what the research has been, but also what my own direct phenomenological experience has been after seeing thousands of experiences that goes above and beyond what the academic community is kind of describing in their theoretical frameworks. And so, it sort of starts there from just, having these, lots of different conversations. And I was happy to be able to feature your quote about PTSD trauma therapy within my episode 1000, because I think that actually there's a lot of things that you've been working on that's really at this kind of cutting edge of really bringing in a lot of those immersive storytelling components in a therapeutic context. And so my orientation tends to be a little bit more philosophical, meaning I don't do a lot of like research or empirical verification of this stuff. I'm more just trying to experience all this stuff and see what my own direct experience is and what the language is to come up with these deeper frameworks. And so, I think that's where the ethics work actually has been pretty influential for helping to shape these larger conceptual frameworks on top of all these other aspects of presence. So I guess from there, there's a lot of different insights that I've seen from the things like Mel Slater and his theories of presence, the place illusion and plausibility illusion, versus other aspects of embodied presence, emotional presence, mental and social presence, and active presence. All these aspects of presence are really like a theory of consciousness. And I feel like the medical XR in some ways is at the frontiers of kind of trying to quantify different aspects of consciousness and how to use and modulate consciousness to a therapeutic effect that can be measured. Whereas in more of the entertainment side, it's more of trying to give people an entertaining experience. But I see that there's aspects of the medical world and all these contexts that are all kind of being blended together. So what can we learn from medical XR and architecture and game design and cinematic storytelling and web design and user interface and human computer interaction, and all these things are kind of all being blended together into this kind of meta framework that I refer to as experiential design. But you've been working in for a number of years in your own kind of intuitive way, pioneering and innovating and experimenting and finding that experimental evidence. So I guess that's been a bit of the challenge, is to take something that has been somewhat siloed and fragmented and try to find the ways in which all this stuff fits together to kind of have a vision of where this is all going.
Yeah. Well, what drove you to do the first one? When did you decide you were going to go on this mission?
Well, I had been covering Drupal open source software before. I did the Drupal voices. I've done other, going to conferences and doing interviews at more esoteric conferences. And so I had the experience of wanting to have a question answered and going into a field of a conference where people are committed to being there and having answers and being able to talk to these subject matter experts. And so after I had created my own VR experience, I realized that there really wasn't like anywhere online or anywhere to kind of really learn about what it meant to be able to design these types of experiences. And so the best way that I found was to go to these events to talk to the developers and the creators who are on the front lines in the trenches, really pushing forward what's even possible. And so I had originally signed up to do like a 60-second pitch at SUVR, but it was more of an idea than anything else. And so I didn't really, but then I realized, well, I need to make this concrete and real. And so I just took all this other experience I had from going to conferences and doing interviews. And I just felt like this is a historic moment. I really want to document it. The excitement around 2014 was palpable, especially after Facebook bought Oculus. It was like things had kind of moved into another scale. Like this is happening now. The resources are there, and the industry kind of woke up in that March of 2014. And that first gathering that I went to in May of 2014 was a Silicon Valley Virtual Reality Conference, an expo, which is the first kind of professional gathering in the modern resurgence of consumer VR. There have been many, as you know, there's been many gatherings of VR from professionals, especially in the medical context over many years. But the first kind of modern resurgence of the gathering of this kind of the new wave of VR. And I was there to sort of just help document and talk to all these people. And yeah, and after that, it was like, James Blaha with Vivid Visions, he was talking about how he was able to cure his lazy eye with VR and how VR is able to control the perceptual input into your brain. And it was like, that just absolutely blew my mind, that like there's something that this technology can like, through the principles of neuroplasticity, rewire your brain and actually have medical impact on you. And that medical case of what James Blaha was able to prove out and was showing at SVVR, it was like, it felt like, oh my gosh, like what else is possible? We don't even like, this is a new medium. What's it mean to have all this stuff? And I feel like I was able to kind of capture that kind of excitement and looking forward, but also over the course of 7 years, recording all these different kind of snapshots. And so, yeah, as I was putting together my episode 1000, it was an opportunity to kind of actually look back and see what people were saying. And I was like, oh, wow, this is a real opportunity to kind of just see how, this body of interviews and oral history conversations is kind of creating this larger historical context of the development of this medium as it's unfolding, but also to see where it's at now and to kind of project out into the future where it could go based upon what the science and what the deeper principles are, and trying to find out what those principles are so that not only people who are creating experiences could kind of really do all the trade-offs that they need to do to kind of get the effect that they want to get, but also like have this unbounded potential for all these other aspects of the domains of human experience that is going to be applied in. And I think that's where I think I've been really focused on, above and beyond, say, like gaming. A lot of like Upload to VR or Road to VR, or VR Scout even, they've been really focused on the entertainment context, but to try to open up that scope to see all these other different industry verticals and see how there's kind of like this need for this interdisciplinary collaboration across all these different contexts and industries. And based upon whatever expertise people are bringing into, then they're going to have a unique insight or lens into the medium. And I still find that true today, as people are learning about it based upon their own training and their own context and their own background and the ways that they want to use the medium, and just being able to learn from them to see how, okay, biometric data, what's the real-time biometric data going to look like? Well, that's something that the medical field has already been using a lot, but that's kind of in the next wave of VR, starting to bring in all these additional sensors of eye tracking and galvanic skin response and all these other things that start to get in there. Now, how are you going to use that from an experiential perspective? But then what are the ethical issues that also come up there?
I have to agree with you that 2014 was a pivotal year, especially for me up to that point. I had been, to tons and tons of conferences and events and met a lot of people in the field, but because there wasn't such a wide uptake, it was a lot of the same conversations over and over. I don't want to say the field got stale, because the people involved in the field were always visionaries. There were people that got involved early on that saw this vision and also had endurance to be able to stick it out during the lean years. But 2014 was when things really turned around, and a whole infusion of new blood, new ideas came about. And I remember going to the first or the second LA VR event, and I was shocked that there were like thousands of people waiting in line to get in. And it's like, oh my God, I haven't seen this, I don't think, ever. And it really struck me that, hey, it might be for real this time, that we have this momentum going. Let's try to maximize it. And as you say, the interdisciplinary nature of this whole field is what makes it really unique and special, because you have artists and programmers and psychologists and engineers and interface designers and storytellers all talking the same language. And so 2014 was a pivotal time. And I'm glad you have that documented. And I know that you've got a lot of us old guys in your mix too, so that you get to hear, what came before. But really remarkable period. And it goes on today. I was worrying that, at certain points, well, it might fade, it might die. This might be another thing, another hype cycle we all get excited about. But I see more and more growth in other areas that encourages me that I think we're on the right path. And we can talk about a little bit that later. Let me just do a closing thing on the podcast, because I do want to get into your thoughts about the field in general. Were there, when you were deciding on people to interview, did you have a hard time at first getting interviews, or was everybody pretty open? And were there any interviews that really kind of shocked you? Like, I mean, I think you've done about 600 that you haven't recorded or you haven't published yet. Were there any that really kind of shocked you? Well, naming names, or don't want any dirt or drama here, but
yeah, well, I guess the thing about conferences is that when people go to conferences, they have their attention committed to being there. So it's actually a great place to kind of grab people and do an interview. In the beginning, it was more of like, people didn't know who I was, had no context who I was, and it was short conversations. But I think over time, people were listening to the podcast, and it was almost like this collective water cooler conversation about really dreaming about the future of what the medium could be. And they knew that I had an outlet of really diving deep. And so then it became, people were also seeking me out over time, where I didn't know who they were, but it was almost like I would go to these conferences and people would find me, and they would really want to share what they were working on. So a lot that there was, kind of went both ways of both seeing who were either the expo presenters or people who were talking and giving a speech that I would seek out and just go up to and interview. Like, I had a quick chat with Paul Merlucky at SVVR. But also I think over time, there's this kind of like nice asymmetry of people either I not knowing who people were, and I have a chance to kind of get introduced to their work by having a conversation and recording it and releasing it to the world. Or people that I'm sort of just tracking either through Twitter or social media, or just seeing the kind of like, who are the important people that I know in the industry and who are they talking to, and just kind of doing this implicit social network analysis as I go to these different events to really kind of find out who the mover and shakers were that are really at the community level, really driving the future of the medium. And I'm happy to, as I look back on episode 1000, of really kind of having a nice diverse sample of a lot of those different people who are really either leaders in the field or just have interesting ideas, and just you get a big mix of different perspectives. And probably, some of the people that surprised me the most, the biggest one probably was talking to Tom Furness in September, or it was in 2015. And, when I asked him the ultimate potential of VR, he said, well, the ultimate potential of reality is reality. And that's kind of a refrain that Jaron Lanier also said, that, the virtual reality experience actually happens when you take the headset off, and how this as a medium is kind of rewiring our brain. And as we rewire our brain, we're also changing the way that we perceive the world. And those are the two quotes that I end the episode 1000 with, because it kind of, for me, really brought home that, like, yeah, you can go into these virtual worlds, but really you need to be in right relationship to not only the world around you, but other people, and you can be able to learn about yourself as well. So I think I was able to, I mean, I originally thought that I was going to do this podcast for like, okay, here is the chronological order of things that really blew my mind. But what I ended up doing was a little bit more of kind of the challenge that we had at Laval Virtual, which was like doing a brain dump of all the different ethical issues. And then you look at it and you're like, what is the underlying ordering principle of all these different issues? And for me, that comes down to context and ways in which that there's certain contextual dimensions where the ethical issues are contained, but also within XR, there's different industry verticals or different contexts in which that we're going to see develop, whether that's identity and embodiment and agency, or whether that's different aspects of gaming and entertainment and medical applications and finance and telepresence and communication and education and higher education and training and working things in your career, or hanging out with friends and family, being able to capture your memories, being able to deal with trauma and medical issues, or aspects of exile and deeper philosophical ideas. So all these different things are kind of a matrix of all these different contexts. And I think that, it's from Laval Virtual where it was like, hey, we've got all these things. What is the way that we kind of make sense of these to start to kind of break it down a little bit? And I think that, I had asked people about the ultimate potential of VR. And, I just, from that mapping of all these different contexts, I sort of took this initial kind of, rough mapping and then started applying it to those contextual domains. And later I came across a philosopher named Helen Niesenbaum, who has a whole theory of contextual integrity of privacy, meaning that she says that privacy is all about appropriate flows of information according to the context that you're in. Like, so when you're going into a doctor's office, you share medical information with your doctor because you know that information is going to contextually help you have this larger goal of allowing you to heal. But I think the challenge with XR, just ethic in general and ethical and sort of ethics and privacy, is that we have all these established contexts, but now all of a sudden we're basically collapsing all those contexts into this one universal context. And that context collapse creates these ethical and moral dilemmas. In other words, now all of a sudden you have consumer technology that has the same level of medical data and medical information that used to only be available to people that had sort of FDA approved medical devices, and that the FDA medical device would be treated with HIPAA, and that information would be treated as like super secret, and you would not be just using it to try to psychographically profile me to try to figure out what my likes or dislikes are. So that's what I kind of see as a challenge, which is that these devices are not medical devices. And in fact, I suspect that Oculus will do everything they can to avoid having the Oculus Quest ever be sort of classified as a medical device, because they don't want this information that would normally be medical information to be classified as medical information, because they don't want to have to be regulated as a medical device. They don't want any
regulation at all, right?
So I've actually seen signs over the last year or so of Oculus kind of deliberately abandoning any sort of thing to do with medical XR. In fact, if you look at a lot of the medical XR startups, you don't see them using Oculus Go's anymore. You see them using the Pico, because the latest iteration of the Oculus Quest requiring people to use a very specific username for to be able to use the device is not HIPAA compliant. And so, and they don't want to be HIPAA compliant. They don't care. They're trying to grow the market and from a consumer scale. And this whole kind of medical context seems to be a little bit more of a diversion for them. So I've actually seen, some of this where the platform aspects actually could be potentially holding back medical XR, because people are even just trying to get apps on App Lab are getting trouble getting stuff approved. Even when they show that they have medical research, that's almost like a negative thing to have medical data saying that your app is going to have some sort of medical context, because then all of a sudden that puts this, the Quest into a medical context that they are trying to avoid. They used to be doing some brain control interface research, but they recently completely abandoned it because, again, I think I was at a neuro kind kind of as an ethical considerations of neurotechnologies that was sponsored by Facebook Reality Labs and Columbia University. And their discussion was, hey, Rafael Yusta, who's one of the founders of the Neurorights Initiative and came up with this whole ethical framework around neurorights. He was saying this should be medical data. We should be classifying this as medical data. I think when that got back up to folks at Facebook, they're like, hey, let's completely abandon anything that is going to be pushing us towards the direction of having these XR devices be classified as medical devices. And so then they said, we're actually moving more towards the EMG, which is the control labs, to be able to have these, what are probably going to eventually be watches that are measuring movements in your wrist to be able to take neural inputs. And that's going to be their neural input devices rather than a brain control interface that's reading your brain waves, because reading your brain waves is not only creepy, but it also doesn't work as well for input device, but also it puts all this neuro rights conversation at the forefront that I think they want to try to avoid. So there's ways in which that these kind of ethical discussions are maybe subtly pushing the industry in a certain way that's actually potentially harming the innovation when it comes to medical XR applications, because it's no longer easy to just take, some of the, I would argue that in some ways Facebook has the best VR technology, but is not really set up to be able to deal with either FERPA laws for education or for HIPAA laws for medical devices. And they've been unwilling to, or maybe just resistant from other business or internal reasons. So I don't know if you've seen something similar or if you have any other thoughts.
Well, I was just thinking, the recent announcement by Apple. Apple doesn't seem to be shying away from their phone being seen as a potential diagnostic tool. There was a recent piece that came out about using the iPhone to detect depression, anxiety from vocal parameters, behavioral elements, the speed in which somebody might scan something or search for something, the travel of the phone. These are things that we've always thought about in building up better mobile apps that may have a virtual human element to it to engage people, but to connect with sensors that pick up physiology and so on. So, in some sense, Apple, by supporting that work, there's a project going on at UCLA, is taking an exact opposite approach of Facebook. They seem to be embracing the potential. I don't know how it's going to shake out. What's your view about the best places to create these kind of applications that do, that frankly say this is a medical application? It may have a safe harbor designation or some other type of designation that doesn't make it as critical. But do you think it's the medical device manufacturers that in the end will build their own technology, maybe reverse engineer a Quest or use an already existing system? Do you see that as being a way that the medical field will advance, leveraging the new technologies that are possible in stimulus delivery, if you will, VR headsets?
Well, as I look at different medical XR companies and see, because I was like, hey, are they still even using Oculus Go or Oculus products? And it doesn't seem like a lot of them are. They've moved to kind of Pico. But yeah, Pico at the same time might be being acquired by TikTok / ByteDance. So, there may be other things where even Pico may not be a safe harbor.
Right.
And, maybe this is eventually, if Apple comes up with a device, they'll be more friendly for medical XR applications. But, ideally, what I think the future that we all want to live into is that we don't have these VR hardware technologies that are necessarily tied into, say, a social network, or have to have like some other that seems to be like a tie that is creating an anti-competitive context, because the EU has some issues with that, and the Oculus as a company may actually find more antitrust legislation being brought forth in European countries against the kind of trying to decouple this need for a Facebook username account in order to use a piece of hardware. This is moving into a direction where everything's sort of consolidated, and in order for you to even use any computing technologies, you have to have a very specific account on somebody's social media website. Whereas right now, that's not true with your computer. And to some extent, it's somewhat true with your phones, with iOS and Android. They have a similar kind of setup, but we're kind of moving into a future of computing technology that is this tightly coupled thing that We want to have, I think, this more open platform that's more agnostic. And if we had that, then you could take this hardware device and do whatever you want. But because, there are things like SideQuest with the Oculus. And so maybe, just kind of going completely off the official track of the App Store, because there's the SideQuest to be able to sideload information but then there's like the Oculus App Lab, and then there's enterprise use cases and whatnot. So there's existing things that could theoretically work, but yet at the same time, I've just seen some shifts in the medical XR, and I need to get more insights from more different people just to see how many of these different XR medical companies are still even on the Oculus platform.
Right,
so
right.
It's an issue that I think is that I've seen arise, and I've kind of seen, like, if you try to search for medical applications on the App Store, it's hard. They're actually really hard to find.
Yeah. Well, the one value I see with what Facebook has done is they're driving the engineering, and, they have a jump start on many things. I personally love my Quest 2. I find it really, really useful for a lot of things, but, they've got the jump on it, but it's not going to be long before other groups take these advances in technology and start building these devices. And I'm really starting to study the medical device field a little further, and seeing companies that are looking at this on their roadmap for the future, building out their own headsets or working with an existing manufacturer to evolve something that fits into the space that has all the protections, all the privacy issues locked into it, but still has the fidelity, the comfort, the tracking, resolution, all the things that make a good VR experience. So I'm hoping that's the direction it goes in. I mean, do you see Oculus as being the de facto leader forever? Or, I mean, they're certainly throwing resources into the mix here, but do you see it being like, well, okay, Ford, Motors, mass production, auto, they got the first start, but certainly they're not the only car company in the world now, and not the best either.
Well, I certainly hope not. And I think in order for VR to reach their potential, we can't have it be driven by just one company, because I think there is a value and diversity of different approaches. I mean, even just looking at, say, the tracking for the Vive using external lasers versus sort of the inside out version, there's still things that you can do, and say, having full embodied experiences in like social VR, like VR chat with like Vive trackers, that you can have like a full embodied experience that goes above and beyond what you could ever do right now, at least with having sort of the inside out type of tracking. And so there's a value of having different approaches or different trade-offs, because there's always design trade-offs that you have to make. And the reason why diversity is important there is because there's certain use cases that are better if you're optimized for those different trade-offs. So what I saw, at least in the market, was that once the Go came up, I saw an explosion of different, medical VR applications, but then sort of this shift towards everything moving towards the Quest meant that, also there was kind of a diminishment there. And so there's other PC VR that's still there with the Vive and everything else, but yet that requires so much of an investment to buy a PC and have all that, it's just a lot more logistically more difficult. And so the standalone form factor, I think, is the way where everything is going. And I expect that over time, Apple, Google, other companies, the Lynx is coming out with, like more of an open hardware solutions. And so, to really have these open alternatives, I think eventually we're going to get there. We have the Steam Deck that may eventually turn into more mobile VR for Valve. Valve is also focusing on Project Galea, which has all these kind of more brain-computer interface and more like EMG and pupillary to be able to measure blood flow with PPV. And all of these other sensors that could be used actually in a medical context. So it could be that we stick with the PC-based tethered VR for a while, but eventually, in order for things to really operate and get deployed at scale, I do expect that the standalone form factor is going to be pretty key. And the Oculus Go, even though it was only 3 DOF, there was still a lot of medical VR applications that were able to, like Applied VR was doing lots of different pain management stuff, but they didn't really necessarily need all of the 6 DOF stuff. And arguably it'd be easier to kind of deploy that stuff if you're just watching a 360 video where your head's turning, where you don't, the tracking for 6 DOF actually gets in the way, because you don't, is it kind of like a worse kind of user experience overall when you have to kind of worry about losing tracking and setting up tracking. And so, you know, it's sad to see in some ways kind of like the larger entertainment industry not really keep alive something like the Oculus Go, because there actually were quite a number of different really compelling medical VR applications that were using that and be able to operate at scale. But that's not where the overall market is going. And I think in the long run, it's going to be better for the industry to have the full embracement of 6DoF. But in this short term, we have this kind of like one company monopolizing all of the standalones without much of a viable competitor right now. But I don't expect that to be true forever, especially if VR continues to grow. It's just, there's going to be other people that are getting into that ecosystem, and it'll just be a matter of time.
What do you think on the HP direction with the Omnicept, with the idea of putting sensors actually in the headset for, of course, eye tracking, which is just becoming, the norm basically in a lot of headsets for foveal rendering, but also using that in pupillary dilation and heart rate picked up from the pad around the headset. What's your view on that? You think that's going to be a go? Do you think that's going to move forward, or because it has a lot of value, of course, in clinical applications, studying emotional reactivity, attention, so forth?
Yeah, so I actually was sent an Omnicept to be able to try out, but also to do an interview with HP, and I've got an interview with them that I hope to get out within the next week or two. So there's things that they can do with, say, measuring cognitive load. I think generally what I'd say is that there's a lot of research that's been done in terms of like taking these biometric signals and then being able to translate them into, say, useful applications. And so probably the most compelling useful applications have been training. So to be able to look at what's happening in someone in a training context, to be able to get this additional information and context to be able to help tune the learning experience. Based, if people have high cognitive load, that mean that they're struggling. And so you may be able to feed that back into the design in real time.
Right.
So it's good to have stuff like out there that is pushing forth all those different sensors, and it's in a context where it's going to be within, like, say, a professional context, say training, or it's not like, I mean, you could buy one and just use it in a consumer context, but the real issue is when you start to have all these different sensors made available, like eye tracking and all this stuff that is in the near term timeline. And then the questions around privacy and ethics start to really get in, is like, okay, what's happening to that data? Because that data can be very revealing. When you have these professional training contexts, it's not as much of an ethical dilemma because it's a bounded context. It's when you start to have the context collapse and sort of using these medical grade technologies and consumer technologies where you're like, okay, what happens to the data? How's that data used? And then how do we have this kind of fundamental neuro rights, which Raphael used to identify as the right to identity, the right to mental privacy, the right to agency, and the right to have like fair access to these experiences. So given that there's a set of these different neuro rights principles that are addressing things like identity, agency, and right to mental privacy. So it's those issues of mental privacy of, as we get more and more of these medical devices, then you're able to potentially discern what's happening inside of our head that is going above and beyond what you're willing to disclose. And kind of crossing this line, what Helen Niesebaum would say, it's no longer appropriate context. It's sort of inappropriate flows of information that are creating new contextual norms. That's the challenge with the XR technologies, is that usually contextually appropriate information. So like when you go to a doctor's office and you're sharing medical information, that's an established norm of the relationship between a patient and a doctor that's been there for thousands of years. And we've, as a society, been able to negotiate that. The challenge with XR technology is that it's basically like an evolutionarily impulse to say, okay, now that we're gathering all this data, now we have new social norms, and it's just sort of like a rapid iteration of where there's more potential harms there for not knowing how to put the ethical guardrails into place to ensure that those norms are what we're really agreeing to as a society, that these are appropriate or not.
Mm-hmm. Now, this is a good segue into talking a little bit deeper about your ethical framework and some of the things, the observations that you've made so far. Aside from the privacy issue, what do you think is the next big challenge that we have to face?
Well, I mean, it really depends on the context, what type of applications that you're doing. So like, say, if you're doing social VR, then harassment is dealing with ways in which dealing with like the different harassment. And we already have harassment issues that are there. But as the, like, say, social network context starts to explode, and then Facebook is a network of 3 billion people, and they have lots of different ways of misinformation and disinformation and different impacts on society. The Wall Street Journal just did the Facebook files expose where they're really detailing all these different things, and everything from like human trafficking and mobs and genocide in Rwanda, different aspects of like these human rights transgressions, and how that is amplified when you have a network that it's 3 billion people. The VR is not at that network scale to be able to have those different types of network effects, but we'll get there eventually. If XR continues to grow, then the same issues that we're seeing in social media will start to be replicated within our XR technology networks, but not as much sort of like abstracted into written text that goes viral, but more of maybe in real time, maybe their experiences. So for me, there's different aspects of like sort of accessibility, diversity, and inclusion that I think are persistent. Algorithmic transparency in terms of how are these algorithms driving ways in which that we're operating with each other, and that's something that's existing in 2D and will continue to have an impact of like what is the different types of transparency that we have and the ways that we're modulating all these different things. I think virtual avatars are going to be much bigger in terms of when you're interacting with people, there's certain social conceits that you have where those could actually be seen as vulnerabilities, where you could use AI, virtual agents, to kind of start to exploit our social constructions of what it means to be nice, but they're actually being driven by motives that may not be in alignment with what we want as the end user. So yeah, I mean, there's lots of different context there in terms of identity, the financial aspects. What are the business models that are driving this? I think is a huge dimension. Are we going to continue to have surveillance capitalism that's really tracking us all the time? And then identity, the ways that we can express our identity, having a diverse range of different avatar representations that are made available. So yeah, I think for each of these different contexts, depending on what your application is, there's going to be a different set of different ethical dilemmas that you're going to have to address. And I think that's part of the work that I then continued on with the IEEE Global Initiative on the Ethics of Extended Reality, was to kind of take some of these different, the XR Ethics Manifesto that I put together and start to really dig into different aspects of, say, like education or social harassment or privacy and diversity and inclusion. And, these issues are kind of never ending, and it was a volunteer effort. And so there's going to be like an iterative approach, I think, over time of trying to kind of like not only map out what all the different things that people have to be aware of. Just as an example, I mean, as you have anybody that's making a VR experience, there may be certain things of, say, you may be able to trigger seizure responses within people within XR experience. And that's something that would normally be within a sort of medical context, but that's also something that's going to be universal. So what are the implications of embodiment? What are the ways in which that you need to look at things like depersonalization, or are there other medical conditions that you need to be aware of that you're maybe not taking consideration of and designing things for in your experience that may be triggering people into either trauma reactions, which then gets into the entertainment context and the degrees in which that you have a violent content, and what's the line between violence or different experiences that were actually maybe creating different aspects of trauma. So there's a wide range, I think, of different aspects. And I think one approach is to try to like map out all those different contexts. And so given, if you're just a game developer, what do you need to know about each of these different aspects so that, you're making decisions that are trying to minimize harm to people as they go into these XR experiences?
Well, I think definitely in the field of mental health, the most contentious issue is something you brought up in terms of the use of virtual humans and AI brought together. We play around with developing clinical interview agents, healthcare support agents, and so forth. But we never really think to cross the line that these are actual virtual therapists. I think that at some point, technology, it may already be there, but technology will be relatively commonplace enough that you could begin to build, under the guise of a virtual friend or a virtual companion, characters that are available 24/7. They have an intimate knowledge of all your digital experience, whether it's conversations they've had with you. They have encyclopedic knowledge of every clinical condition and process for addressing those clinical conditions. And will these things masquerade as virtual companions, friends, guides, when they're frankly being designed as a therapeutic aid? Now, we know that we have a real problem with promoting access to mental health care. How do we address it? But at the same time, preserve the element of, the person to person element that we all know we've missed a little bit during COVID. That is essential for maybe motivating or engaging a person in a therapeutic alliance. I think it's going to be the biggest issue in the future, at least in my field in clinical psychology, but all the other caring professions as this technology evolves. I don't know if do you see that as an issue that would be beyond clinical care? Like, would it be children, instead of having an imaginary friend, they have a virtual friend that they share intimate experiences with and ask questions? Is it something beyond creepy to think about that as maybe a tool for helping people to learn to self-reflect, or to understand their experience better, or to just ask questions they'd be too embarrassed to ask anybody else?
I think if there's one thing that I've learned around looking at XR is like every aspect that's a new affordance that can be used in a positive context could also be used and exploited in a negative context. And so there's ways in which that, a lot of the stuff that you've been working on with virtual humans and in a therapeutic context, well, that is going to, eventually make its way into an entertainment context where you're in a video game and you're kind of having these different interactions with non-player characters, and it's going to be rewarding to be able to have that. But yet at the same time, if you're in a social network context, I mean, we already are in a social media environment where we may unwittingly be interacting with bots or troll armies. And so to be able to, really operate at scale in a real-time immersive environment would be through these AI agents. And so what are the roles of these AI agents? Is it possible to say, have an AI agent within, say, VR chat, or these different worlds where, the test to be able to, the Turing test to be able to actually prove that you're human? There's a lot of ways that we have that built into our existing infrastructure, because it is, despite the fact that, you get emails that are asking for you to donate all this money to save, kind of like ridiculous scams. But, there's enough people that click on that make it work. So if there's enough benefit of having some sort of interaction with people and a face-to-face interaction in a virtual environment, then you can guarantee that there's going to be a similar kind of like troll army AI bots that are out to kind of like waste your time or get you to kind of do something that you don't want to do.
Right.
I think one mitigating factor to that is at least that a lot of what I've seen in, say, social VR networks is that a lot of that type of social interactions actually gets set into these private instances where it's like you're pulling people into your own private world that you already have like 1 or 2 degrees of network separation from those people. So if there's a friend of a friend that's a bot that comes in that may be tricking you or fooling you, but if that happens and that bot is connected to you, then there's a deeper social dynamic of making sure that your friends list isn't filled with bots that are annoying people. But these public spaces, I think that's where, it's kind of a free for all, where Facebook has to do a lot more aggressive monitoring and insurance that there's these are safe online spaces, because then once you get into a private context, it's a little bit easier to control because it's based upon your social network graph of you being connected to people that are there. But when you go into these public spaces, then that's where I expect to see a lot more of that type of, like, eventually you may be talking to someone and you may be asking, is this a real human? Is this an AI? Maybe you'd be able to do that. We have our own kind of implicit Turing test that we have. Yeah, I expect it to be an issue to be able to, because social engineering is already probably one of the biggest ways in which that people leak their passwords or whatnot. So like you can kind of expect that the same type of social engineering is going to be applied at an AI agents in these virtual worlds. We're not anywhere close to that. I haven't heard of anything like that yet. And we're not at the scale for it to be profitable for people to even bother doing that. But as VR grows and you have these bigger and bigger virtual worlds, and the metaverse kind of has more of a one-to-one parity in terms of the expanding out to the vastness of the world, and eventually beyond the vastness of the world, because it's infinite and virtual. And when you have the users, I guess is the main thing, that are in there, and you have that network effect, then I think that's where you're going to start to have more of that.
Interesting. Well, I knew 45 minutes would not be enough time. I've got 1,000 questions I still want to ask you, but I want to ask Jessica if we have any questions from the audience. If not, I can dig into mine a little further. We still have another 10 minutes left.
Yeah, so we actually have two questions from the audience. The first one, they wanted to ask Kent that what is his biggest ethical concerns with VR that you think that everybody should pay attention, even just for home use or any regular use of VR technology?
Well, my biggest concern is privacy, and the fact that one of the biggest drivers of XR technology, Facebook, is in the business of surveillance capitalism, meaning that they have a business model of having lots of psychographic profiling information and living into a future where everything you do or say is going to be tracked by this company and extrapolated. And it gets down to those neurorights from Raphael Yusta, which is like undermining your aspects of your own identity. So being able to express different aspects of who you are in a way that you're consenting and sharing who you are, rather than having algorithms track everything you say or do, and your eye movements and your eye tracking and your pupil dilation, and to be able to have algorithmic driven psychographic profiling. So there's identity, there's your agency. So being able to undermine your own right to make your own decisions, but to create a context that things may be influencing you in ways that you're not even consciously aware of. So that level of, the fixed action patterns is what behavioral neuroscientists call it, which is that these kind of Skinner box automatic reactions, but being able to potentially trigger a series of fixed action patterns within people to kind of do mass manipulation. So the agency, but also the mental privacy, which is the different aspects of what's happening inside of your brain. So I think those are the biggest things. And I think we don't have a federal privacy law. And there's a lot of ways in which that these neuro technologies are kind of creating, it used to be tied to identity, but we're going to be moving from a concept of thinking about privacy in terms of who we are to this kind of more of like, what's my likes, what's my preference, what's the psychographic profiling of the character of who I am. It's like a digital twin that these companies want to create. And it's more about mapping all those different things out in real time. So for me, that's the biggest ethical issue that we still haven't figured out a good solution to, because our concepts of privacy are not in our ways of kind of having checks and balances of this larger economic context isn't doing anything to address any of those different issues. It's basically like the way that the privacy policies are written by Facebook and the technological roadmap means we're kind of sleepwalking into a dystopia of a privacy nightmare. And I I don't know what to do to stop it, because it's a complicated issue, and it may end up having new laws be created. But even then, you have to sort of create a legal framework that has this new paradigm that is able to accommodate all these different aspects of a conceptual framework of privacy, which is already a very hard thing to pin down, absence of what the context is. So given that, the fact that the biggest company that's promoting XR is a surveillance capitalism company, and the roadmap towards privacy is sleepwalking into a dystopic privacy nightmare.
Yeah, that sounds like something everybody needs to be, at least keep it in the back of the mind so they can educate themselves more on the issue. And there's another question that came up in the audience. It's what are the things that you're most excited about the VR industry recently? Any news that you think that's worth sharing with our audience?
Well, I think there's been a lot of recent talk about the metaverse, and I think that within itself is kind of raising up a general awareness of this vision of what all this means as we move forward. So there's a bit of crossing the chasm from something that has been these early adopters and innovators, and kind of moving more into mainstream discussions, which is exciting, but also scary, because it's sort of like, it's like this exponential growth and explosion that kind of then gets out of anybody's ability to comprehend or understand the shifts in culture that are happening. I'm really excited actually about a lot of the medical XR applications and consciousness hacking, and this idea that we're going to have more ways of using these real-time streams of our biometric data to be able to kind of reflect upon our own consciousness. Apps like Trip that I think are on this roadmap of doing aspects of that, some more contemplative aspects there. But yeah, for me, I get really excited about what's happening in immersive storytelling. So I feel like there's a lot of ways there's a lot of innovations and experimentations about the affordance of the medium that bring emotional impact that I think are going to be universal across all these other contexts. But a lot of those are very ephemeral at film festivals, so you have to kind of see it at the festival. But a lot of my coverage lately has been going to these festivals and talking to these creators, because I feel like that, for me, is the most exciting kind of breeding ground for innovation and creativity, and pushing the limits of what's possible with the medium. Looking to see what the artists and the storytellers are doing with the medium is going to drive the future of the medium. And there's going to be all these other aspects of like rewiring your brain and tapping into latent human potentials that we don't know are possible yet. I think that's sort of like, are there things that we can do as humans that we don't know yet, because we have to train ourselves within these VR programs? You know, kind of like the James Blaha was able to retrain his eyes to see in 3D. Are there ways that we kind of metaphorically can train our body to do things that we couldn't do yet, because we just haven't created the right VR training to be able to actually kind of fine tune different aspects of our consciousness? So that, and I just get excited about the philosophical implications and, you know, where this is all going. So trying to just kind of map out these trends of seeing how these little building blocks are being built together, and then kind of just projecting out into this future dreaming space to see what it all means and where it's all going.
I have a real quick one that I like to ask all the folks that are on this program, and that is, if you had 2 years and unlimited funding to bang out a VR project, what would it be in?
Well, I have a provocation that is something that I kind of got me into VR, which is like creating a memory palace of all space and time. And I think because I've created this archive of all this data, then I always thinking about like, what's all this? How would you go into an immersive experience and be able to actually find and discover and learn something? I want to be able to live in a future where I go into, if I want to learn about, say, Alfred North Whitehead's process philosophy, and I want to be able to see like an immersive architecture that's dynamic and changing and growing, and I can just go into an immersive experience that really gives me an embodied experience that allows me to understand these deep abstract concepts in a way that allows me to kind of understand the nature of reality better. So given that conceit of like combining aspects of music visualization, so music visualization, and trying to look at music and see and understand spatial architecture that allows you to hear and understand the music theory better. But then on top of that, being able to kind of understand the nature of time and how time unfolds. And to create, like, as I'm creating this historical document of all these interviews, are there interesting ways to kind of like slice and dice that so that you could have dynamic architecture that you go into an immersive experience and say, hey, I'm interested in medical XR, or maybe you're interested in this very specific thing about a specific type of galvanic skin response, or pupil dilation of heart rate variability. And you want to see all the different conversations I've had across like 620 hours of conversations, but being able to kind of like hone into very specific things and have like a network graph that allows you to see the relational context and how all these things are kind of tied together. So that's sort of a WebXR open web experience that it basically be like a memory palace of the history of VR, but with the oral history context that then you could ask an AI agent, hey, I'm really interested in this. And then they would point you in the direction to go to. So what does it look like to think about the websites of the future and a knowledge repository of all these different insights, and to be able to kind of like ask in a more Socratic method of being able to talk to the AI, and then go and discover a podcast, and then maybe you push a few buttons and then you can go listen to those podcast episodes that were just exactly what you need to learn at that moment, and create this larger spatial context that allows people to have better access than what I have right now, which is a big giant RSS feed with 1,000 episodes, and it's not even well tagged yet. So kind of relaunching the website to be able to have that. So that's my dream, if that's what I would want to make and create.
It sounds like a great project for the Smithsonian to fund. Okay, well, Ken, I can't tell you. how grateful I am that you spent this time with us and you've shared your thoughts and ideas. And I know that the audience listening live has probably benefited quite a bit, but this will live on forever. It's a recorded podcast, so others can check it out. So thank you for your time. And we'll, maybe in a year or so, we can check back with you and see what's new and what you're thinking about. So thanks.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me, Skip, and for the cognitive VR.
All righty.
Yeah. Thank you for a speaker and also Dr. Skip for hosting the event. Just one last little thing about the company. As I mentioned, we are doing a study trial for one of our VR product that we're testing children aged 6 to 13 years old to participate in the study using our products, checking their attentions, using our attention tracker. So if you know anybody who might be qualified for the study, please check us out. You can scan the QR code to find out our, fill out the interest form and we'll reach out to you. Thank you so much. And just one last, once again, thank you so much for coming to our event today. And I hope you have learned so much from our amazing speaker today. And thank you, Ken. And thank you again to our host, Dr. Rizzo. I believe we all learned so much about VR today. And for our audience, the video recording of the event will be available on YouTube at our channel at Cognitive Leap Solutions, Inc. So please feel free to share with anyone who might be interested in the topic. And we're really looking forward to seeing you again at our next event. So hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
Ken. All right. We'll talk again soon, bro.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks again for having me.
Thanks.
See ya. Bye.